Hello, everyone. Welcome back to class. This is Professor Gunner speaking, and today we're going to be continuing our introduction to philosophy of environment by doing a quick recap of what we looked at last time, and then talking about an important distinction that we're going to rely on moving forward in this class, namely the distinction between natural and artificial. As we will see, this is kind of a messy, vague distinction. So, a lot of the philosophy that we're going to be doing is going to depend on what your thoughts are about this distinction, whether you think it is firm and makes sense, and ultimately what you think the origin of our reality is. But as we go through the semester, you'll see what I mean by that, and we'll interrogate some of those metaphysical questions near the end of class. To start, let's just go over again what we looked at in the short last lecture that we did. We basically looked at definitions of environment. One thing that I did not go over explicitly, although I'd like to kind of hammer it down right now, is that environment comes from this word, this root that means to surround. So, one way that we can define environment is that which surrounds and influences human life. This could obviously mean the natural environment outside of us, such as the biological or the physical environment in which we find ourselves. But it could also mean those things that we have constructed or participated in constructing that surrounds and affects our human life. So, when we talk about something which surrounds and influences us, that could have a lot of different references. We could be talking about natural ecosystems, other forms of life, such as bacteria and animals, and those systems and relationships that surround us. We could be talking about geography, so mountains, lakes, lands, rivers, and streams, those kinds of things. They would also have an impact on human life and human social development. We could also be talking about the climate, the atmosphere, and, as we'll spend a long time studying in this class, things like culture, society, and all of the artifacts and systems that are associated with that, such as religion, historical events, the architecture that we have built and in which we reside, law, markets, our systems of morality that influence us, political ideologies, and the artifacts of our own creation, such as tools, technologies, infrastructure, stuff like that. So, an environment is basically that which surrounds us and influences our life, which is a pretty general definition, very wide in scope. Another thing that I should have discussed last time, but I'll kind of get a little bit more into the nitty gritty now, is that what we mean by environment or what we characterize as an environment kind of depends on our level of analysis. So, for example, if we're looking at the world from our individualistic human centered position, we might call that which surrounds us this building that I'm sitting in right now, and the society of which I am a part, and the religion and culture that influences my life and my thoughts and my behaviors. But depending on where you start, what level of analysis that you're at, environment could mean a totally different thing. For example, if you imagine that you were an animal in a zoo, you might characterize your environment as your enclosure, that those walls that are around you and whatever is in them. Or, for example, if we take the point of view of a cell, we would characterize our immediate environment as the tissue that surrounds us, the other cells that surround us. So we can really talk about environments on all these differing levels of analysis. We can talk about it from the human centered perspective, a more animalistic centered perspective, a singularly celled organism level of perspective, and all of the dimensions and levels higher than those and in between those. So, what an environment is going to depend on basically our starting point. And what we include in our environment is going to be relative kind of to the frameworks and the frames that we bring to our discussion and our way of seeing the world. Now, I talked last time about how the environment has impacted us. We're going to talk about this as we go through this unit a little bit more, but just to provide a general sketch again, environments influence and have influenced our biology. We're going to be looking at a piece that describes how environment has influenced human evolution and human society. It influences our ideas and our systems of thought, and consequently, it influences our culture and society. Depending on the place on Earth that we originated and our ancestors originated, that's going to have a certain influence on the religion, tools, and ways of life that our ancestors ended up developing, faced with those unique ecological problems that we were, depending on different geographical region. But humans are not just impacted by the environments that surround them. We also retroactively influence those environments as well. So, due to human influence, we have influenced the natural world around us, such as the forests, lakes, and rivers outside of our doorstep, and other forms of life as well. We'll talk about this more when we get into environmental philosophy, but this isn't just a one-way street. The environment influences us, and we influence the environment, whatever that is. It's kind of a circle or a feedback loop. So we really exist within a system, a larger system, in which both pieces of this system retroactively influence one another, that then through time end up determining how those parts of the system develop over time. One way that you could say this is that the impact on environment by life is fractal and vice versa. If you've ever seen a fractal, it is something like a repeating pattern that when you zoom in or zoom out of it, you see the pattern repeating at a bunch of different levels. Such is the nature of cause and effect when it comes to environment and life. At each level of analysis, there is a causal relationship between life and environment, and the nature of that causal relationship is going to influence what the relationship is at higher and lower levels of analysis. And these feed off of each other. So, for example, let's say that you live in an apartment like I do that is really cold. That's going to have some sort of impact on your body, which is going to have some sort of impact on your thoughts and your emotions. Consequently, because you're moving in this environment, which is cold, and you're influencing things and moving things around, you are going to have an impact on that environment. So you can kind of picture this as a bunch of feedback loops, depending on what perspective you take towards looking at your environment. Now, that's basically a recap of what we looked at last time. Today, what we're going to be focusing on is an important distinction for this class. The name of this class is Natural and Artificial Environment. And if we're going to talk about natural and artificial environments, we have to try to figure out, what does it mean to call something natural? What does it mean to call something artificial? How are these similar and dissimilar, if at all? Well, that's what this article that I asked you to read tries to take a look at. What does nature mean? By, and I'm going to butcher the author's names here, Ducarme and Couvet. So, if we're going to talk about natural and artificial environments, what kind of concepts or definitions are we invoking? Well, the authors start out by noting it's not obvious exactly what we mean when we use the word nature. The definitions that we have of this word have particular origins, but they have evolved throughout history, and what we include in the concept of nature and what we don't include has changed throughout the years and evolved over time. So, this word nature, this concept of nature, and consequently this word and concept of artificial, is going to be a little bit general, vague, and messy depending on where you look and depending on the field or the discipline that you're concerned with. In this article, What Does Nature Mean? What the authors try to do is analyze the origins and evolution of the word and concept nature in European languages. So they're going to look at how this word was used in the ancient Greek, how it was used in the ancient Latin, and how this word has evolved and developed since the rise of Christianity in the West and the emergence of the natural sciences and Western philosophy over the millennia. This is important to look at because, again, if we're going to be talking about environments and we're going to be categorizing some as artificial and some as natural and saying some are good and some are bad, we should have a better understanding of what exactly we're invoking when we make that distinction. So, what I hope to give you today is something of a brief overview of that distinction. The authors start out by talking about the origins of the word nature in the ancient Greek. They note that this word nature, we can trace it to the Greek phusis, meaning growing or producing. And what this word used to signify was something like the process of growth and the result of that process. These things were linked. The authors note that we find this word in ancient works of philosophy, such as Aristotle's Physics and his Metaphysics, and we also see it in the works of some pre-Socratics as well. The problem is that insofar as Aristotle has been a really influential thinker in the Western tradition, he uses this word in a bunch of different ways. Consequently, this is going to have some sort of impact on our understanding and use of the word as well, since both Plato and Aristotle are such important, influential figures in the history of this philosophical tradition. So, in his Physics, Aristotle distinguishes between a few different definitions of phusis, or nature. It could mean the essence of a thing, like what makes a chair would be the nature of a chair. What makes a book different than a table is that they have different essences or natures. It could mean that. It could mean what something is made of, like the substance of a thing. Or it could mean what the thing will turn out to be, the thing's nature. So, in other words, when we invoke this concept, we could be talking about what makes a thing, what constitutes a thing, like materially or physically, you might say, and the kind of end or final development or phase of a thing. All of these ideas are just invoked in this one work, the Physics. It gets even more complicated when we look at Aristotle's Metaphysics. In this work, he has 4 different definitions for what this word nature or phusis could mean. It could reference the process of growth itself. It could reference what is the organizing principle of growth. So, what is that thing that is determining the growth of a thing? It could also mean the cause of the thing's motion. So imagine you have something growing. You could talk about what is the principle underlying how that thing grows, like the order or the law that guides its growth, or you could talk about that thing, that force that causes it to grow. Or finally, it could mean the substance or matter of a thing. what that thing is ultimately made of. For example, atoms and molecules. That could constitute the nature of the thing. So, from the get go, we kind of have a general fuzzy idea of this concept of nature. And it's used in a bunch of different ways in some of the founding philosophical texts of our tradition. Back in ancient Greek philosophy and society, this concept or word nature often included humankind and its doings. So, as we'll be investigating later, Aristotle thought, for example, that politics was a natural product of human societies and human action. But another important property of nature is that it implies a kind of order, it implies a kind of growth or process. We might oppose it to this idea of chaos or disorder. Because the ancients saw, as they looked around them, that things were not completely random. Leaves grew in a similar way every time. There were natural laws that were kind of baked into how things operated in reality. Things didn't just occur randomly. So, what we get from looking at Aristotle's philosophy is that nature includes humanity and what humans are doing, and it is associated with a kind of order or a kind of uh, law, a kind of law-like property. That goes over kind of some of the ancient Greek uses of this concept or word. The authors also discuss how this word was used in the ancient Latin. They note that our word nature can be traced also to the Latin natura, meaning birth or the initial character of something. In Latin, or I should say Roman philosophy, in contrast to Greek philosophy, the nature of something was contrasted, at least in Cicero, with culture and human influence. So, whereas in the philosophy of the ancient Greeks, what is natural included humans and what they did, in Roman philosophy, ancient Roman philosophy, there was somehow this contrast or distinction between natural things and human culture, human influence, and human invention. So, from that philosophical tradition, we start seeing this idea that we often colloquially invoke today. This idea that there's a difference between, say, the natural environment and the artificial cities and societies that we build for ourselves. So, this contrast has been along for a while, but the authors trace it at least as far back as the writings of Cicero, who was another influential thinker during this time period. Now, the Western tradition didn't stay stuck in Roman legal and moral customs, or just the Greek and Roman ways of looking at the world. Obviously, societies, ideas, and schools of thought evolve over time. And unsurprisingly, after the emergence of Christianity, in Western society, Christianity began to highly influence the way that humans saw the world and how they should act and move within it. Thus, the authors, in their analysis, next talk about how the Christian concept of nature ended up influencing the development of Western thought and society. If you know anything about the Christian story, Christian metaphysics, you might say, Christians think generally that there is this thing called the earth, or you could even imagine the universe as being this thing, which is a creation of God. There is this creator God that exists somehow outside of time and space, who's not subject to the laws of nature, who created that which we see around us now, originally, such as the plants and the animals, the earth, the seas, the mountains, the stars, the heavenly bodies, all of that stuff. So the Christian worldview posited and still posits today that this nature thing is a creation. We can link this to the Hebrew teva, which means the mark of an artist on the artist's work. The idea being something like all of this stuff that we would say is natural, the plants, the animals, the earth, the geography, is the product of an artisan, namely Yahweh, the Creator God. Now, this idea ended up having a certain influence on the development of Western society. Whereas in the past, before the emergence and influence of Christianity and its spread, nature was seen as being infused with some kind of divinity or sacredness. The saturation of Christianity in the West ended up leading to this idea in a lot of people's minds that the natural world was not something that was divine. God is the divine thing. Humans, perhaps before the fall, Adam and Eve, were righteous. But the material world or the natural world is not something that is holy and divine, at least not since the fall into sin. It being permeated now with sin due to the choices of Adam and Eve in the garden. If you follow that story, the idea is something like disobeying God ended up allowing sin to enter the world and permeate all the stuff that you see around you. So, this idea started becoming popular that the natural world is not divine, it's not holy, it is rather just the product of God that has become tainted due to the actions of humanity. And this is actually an idea that has stuck with us today, although phrased a little bit differently. Due to the writings in Genesis and some of the other passages in the Bible, the idea that the material or the natural world is something that has been given to humans for them to rule, to conquer, to appropriate, this idea became more popular as well. And you'll notice, if you remember your Genesis story, where God says that he's basically given mankind the earth to rule or steward in his stead. That's the basic idea that we see. Consequently, as Christianity saturated more and more of the Western world, this idea became more acceptable and it became more commonplace that the natural world is something that humans ought to rule over and control and guide. That humans ought to be its master somehow. And again, this is an idea that still is around today and permeates our collective consciousness. Insofar as we view the natural environment as a means to our end or an instrument in achieving our goals, rather than a biotic system that ought to be respected and loved in its own right. So, the emergence and rise of Christianity also came to strongly influence how we in the West view what nature is, whether or not we should respect it, what our relationship is to it, and consequently, what our concept of artificial is. Tracing all of these historical, cultural, and religious influences, how this word and concept of nature is used, leads us to a troubling conclusion that really no firm consensus exists about what this thing we call nature is. It remains a a vague, fuzzy word and a concept that has multiple meanings, connotations, and denotations. Depending on the kind of upbringing you have, depending on if you do research in the natural sciences or sociology or religious studies, this concept is going to have a different meaning to you. And consequently, what it means for something to be artificial may have a slightly different meaning to you as well. Now, where we're going to end this lecture is by looking at a helpful table that the authors provide in this piece, What Does Nature Mean? And it is within this table that they provide a bunch of different definitions of this word or concept of nature. What these definitions are contrasted with conceptually, and some of the philosophies and schools of thought that these definitions are associated with. So, I'd like to go through these now just one by one to help support this idea that concept, this word nature, has a bunch of different meanings and that we use it in a bunch of different ways nowadays. So, the first definition they provide is this: nature is the whole of material reality independent of human activity and history. So, it's everything that exists that was not created or determined by humans. Thus, under this definition, we would contrast nature with things like culture and tools and technology, the artifacts of human invention. We would call these instead artificial. This view of nature is associated with the philosophical schools of Romanticism and what we might call American Transcendentalism. Romanticism we can characterize as a philosophical movement that sprung up in reaction to the Enlightenment. In European history, the Enlightenment was a time in which there was an explosion of knowledge and inquiry in the sciences and the technical fields, and these thinkers were trying to use reason to understand the world around them and make sense of all this. Well, there were some who saw that project as useful, and some who saw that, yes, while reason can be useful and we should be rational sometimes, it's not the be all end all of human life. Things like emotion and passion and feeling, the arts and music are also incredibly important, although they are not completely rational or rationalizable. This is what Romanticism was all about, leaning into those things that are having to do with passion and the arts and the humanities, rather than seeing the world just through this cold, calculating, rational lens. Transcendentalism was a movement that occurred primarily in the United States, which again was something of a response to this idea that we could reason out and completely rationalize all of human existence. Transcendentalism is associated with the idea that we should be free and independent thinkers, spend time in nature for our own spiritual health, and recognize that everyday experiences are, at bottom, mystical in nature, connecting us to something higher and more perfect and divine than ourselves, although we ourselves are a part of that thing. So, to reiterate, one definition of nature that we have and that we use nowadays is that the whole of material reality is that is independent of human activity and history. Thus, what we would call natural is stuff like the forests, the trees, the rocks, all that. And what is artificial would be like culture, tools, technology, cities. Another definition that we invoke today is this: nature is the whole universe, everything. Or, as C.S. Lewis might put it, the whole show. including humanity. So, this is what we might liken to the contemporary scientific view of the world. That at bottom, everything is a part of nature or a product of this thing that we call nature with a capital N. And if we dig down into it, nature is made up of matter and energy, atoms, molecules, and waves. Under this definition, we would contrast what exists with supernatural things like God and demons and devils and angels, spirits, and ghosts. Those who believe that nature is all that exists, consequently, are going to say God does not exist. There are no such things as angels or demons and all that stuff. And this would lead you to the view that everything that exists is natural, and really this distinction between natural and artificial doesn't really hold. This view that everything is a part of nature or the whole show, including human thought and action and creation, is associated with the contemporary scientific view, like I said before, and Eastern philosophy such as Taoism, which says that everything is a part of the Tao or the way. There is nothing outside of it. The Tao is the course, the flow, or the process of everything that is going on. So, some people invoke this definition. They think that nature is all that there is and everything is a part of it. A definition that is a little more limited in scope is the third one that the authors provide. Some people think nature is the force or cause of life and change in the universe. So it is that underlying force or principle that is responsible for life and movement and motion and change. Thus, we would contrast this concept of nature with inertia or things being fixed. Under this definition, if nature is that force or that cause of things being what they are and doing what they're doing, we might contrast it with things that are artificial, which we would liken to the disruption or the cessation of those natural processes. So, if you're a child, for example, and your teeth are growing, we would say that's a natural process. If I went in there with a needle and I injected some drugs into your gums that changed the chemical composition and your teeth grow differently, we would say that was an unnatural thing I did. I disrupted that process or I got in the way of it. This kind of view of nature is associated with the philosophy of Heraclitus, who said famously that everything is in flux, everything is constantly changing, and a philosophy that emerged within the last few centuries known as vitalism. Vitalism tried to argue that, in part, evolution is not blind or random, but it is fundamentally organized and guided by this internal law or energy or force that is intelligent, and it is driving the development of the universe towards perfection or towards a particular goal. So this is another idea of nature that we have. The force or cause of life and change. It's one that C.S. Lewis talks about in his book Miracles, in which he says, by the word natural, a lot of people mean of itself. Something going on of itself. Finally, similarly to one of the definitions that Aristotle provided earlier, the last definition the authors give us is this. Nature is the essence or whole set of properties of a thing. So the nature of a thing is what makes that thing what it is, or the whole set of properties of the thing, what it is. Consequently, This concept might be contrasted with transmutation, which is this idea that a thing's nature can change. This is kind of what we mean by the word transformation. If you undergo a transformation, you are a new thing. You have a new nature or a new essence. If we're going to invoke the concept of artificial, if nature is the essence or whole set of properties of a thing, then what is artificial is something being what it is not or doing what it doesn't normally do. So you might say the essence of a hammer is that it hammers. That's its purpose. That's what it does well. That's what makes a hammer is that it hammers. Well, if you tried to use a hammer to paint, that would be unnatural. That would be an artificial way to use the hammer. Using the hammer for something it's not designed for. This view has been around for a long time, this idea, this concept. And so I've just written here, it's associated with a millennia of philosophy and science and the development of these things. So, what the authors provide for us in this piece is something of an analysis of the origins of this word nature, its etymology, and how this word and concept has developed since the time of the ancient Greeks and Romans. What can we conclude from all of this? Well, if we're going to invoke this idea that there's a distinction between what is natural and what is artificial, it's going to depend on the definitions that we use. In everyday language, in everyday parlance, what we mean when we say something is artificial is usually something that's created by humans or something that has been disrupted or interrupted in terms of what normally occurs. But as we'll see, as we go through the class, as we get into social and political philosophy, philosophy of technology, environmental philosophy, whether something is natural or artificial is not obvious. Because again, it's going to depend on the definitions that we use. It's going to depend on the worldviews and the frameworks that we bring to the discussion and the analysis. It's important that we look at these origins and these etymologies because they deeply inform the way that we think about these things. And consequently, the concepts and the definitions that we invoke when we use words like nature and natural and artificial have an impact on research, on policy, think environmental policy, on the production of knowledge, and on the development of society and conservation of natural environments. So, the takeaway is this. We don't have just one concept or definition of nature. Consequently, we don't have just one concept or definition of what is artificial. Although we're going to be using these words, think of them more as fuzzy descriptors than necessary and sufficient conditions. Okay, I hope you found this interesting and informational. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to email me. Otherwise, I'll see y'all next time. Bye.